something that is searching for me and needs me to reveal itself.
Okay, so well, that's great. We're rolling. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for taking the time for us to do that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So the purpose of this of our conversation today, it's really to think about the exhibition at Bernar Venet Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So, which starts with words and ends with words. It starts with the words on the wall, with the wall pieces, and it ends with those sound pieces that we can hear
Mm-hmm.
as we go around. But also what we have is sculptures, wall pieces of different varieties, and it seems to me to really reflect your practice as you've been working all over since 1958 onwards, so to say.
Yeah, if you think about when I finished school,
Mm-hmm.
and I was very lucky, I have to say. I consider myself very fortunate in that I had the right teachers who had the right connections in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and I was able to exhibit my work early on. And I met people who seemed to care about what I was doing. Um, and so, really, from the beginning, from the late 50s, I always was able to have my work out on a wall someplace, in a gallery or something like that.
Yeah.
And if you want, I can
Well,
tell you how it
absolutely.
worked more specifically. Well,
Because the formative year was very important to you. First, you had as a teacher Robert Motherwell, and then
that was back in the, yes, that was in the 50s and the late 50s, the
mm-hmm.
mid 50s, I have to say. And he was very interesting, talking about art in general and his life and so forth. And he actually lived not that far from me, and we lived in Manhattan at that time, between the 60s and the 90s and so forth. And um, he was very interesting that he decided well, first of all, he taught a couple of classes, which I took, and my wife, Julia, also.
Mm-hmm.
She decided she wanted to sit in on his classes. And that was interesting. His lectures about art mostly and about the art world.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then I in your senior year, you could ask for one teacher to work as a kind of monitor, and you would see them for 1 hour once a week. They would look over your work and make comments. And surprisingly, he agreed to do it. So I met him. I didn't always meet him at Hunter. Times when I met him at where he lived,
Right.
at his apartment, at his house, I guess you would say. And so I was very lucky that way to have that kind of connection.
Yeah.
And then in those days, if you weren't married and had a family, and you were a young guy in his early 20s, you had to serve your time in the army.
Right.
So after I got my BFA, Bachelor of Fine Arts degree,
Mm-hmm.
but also it wasn't just Motherwell. I mean, there was some other wonderful teachers there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Ray Parker was there, and there were other people that who I worked with, and Beziotis, for instance,
Oh,
was
true.
there. And
Yeah.
you know who taught a contemporary art and art history, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, was William Rubin. He was a young
Oh,
instructor, very dynamic.
really?
And he became eventually the director of the Museum of Modern Art. But when I was there, he was one of the teachers.
Interesting.
The woman who ran the department was really very interesting, and Edna Wells Lutz was her name.
Right.
And she was very involved in the New York art scene and abstract expressionism and all of that kind of thing in the mid 50s.
Right.
This was. So it was a lively time in New York. Okay, so I had to serve my time. I got into the Army Reserve. I had to do 2 years, blah, blah, blah. And so when I came out, everything had changed. The woman who ran the department was gone. I wanted to get my master's degree.
Yeah.
And he said he'd get a master's degree and go to Hunter and so forth. So I got my bachelor's degree. I got my BFA. They didn't have an MFA at that time.
Oh, yeah?
No, it was only master's.
Okay.
But I was very lucky in that I took a design class with Anthony Smith, the sculptor.
Yes.
And he was sort of in that kind of minimal. The first thing he told us to do when we entered the class was go see an Agnes Martin show.
Wow.
I think it might have been our first show in New York, something like that. You know, I had never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
I was still doing action painting, that sort of thing, and
so that
I
must have
couldn't
been
even figure out how she made those things. Tell you the truth,
yeah, it
was
must
so
have been a
perfect.
revelation.
Well, it was, yeah. You know, it sort of entered my mind, and I couldn't deal with it in some ways. You know, how do I? What is that about? You know, the intensity and the looking at this, and I wasn't really sure what I was doing. Is it even art? What is it? You know, it's a whole other way of thinking about confronting this image.
Right.
And essentially one thing led to another.
Yeah.
And
so your work must have changed so much as well.
slowly, in a way, it did. You know, but of course, I didn't make any art when I was in the Army.
Of course,
you know,
yeah.
There was also, I had this whole long half a year or more of not really doing anything, and also Tony had been, as did Gene Goosen, who was the E.C. Goosen, who was a well-known critic and curator and so forth. They had just come. This was their first year. They had just come from Bennington, which was previously another all-girls school, all-women's school, I should say. And he mentioned one of his students who was planning to open a gallery.
Right, absolutely.
Right, and so I went to her. She happened to live in Manhattan or Park Avenue, very nice. And I walked in there with her father. She was living with her father. And there was a big Ellsworth Kelly on the wall. I said, "Oh, okay, that's
that is serious."
What she's talking about. And so one thing led to another, and I did the show with her. She invited me
at the Westerly Gallery, 1964.
Yes, that was the name of the gallery, right?
And on the poster that you realized, you say the first exhibition by Robert Barry's paintings.
Yes, right. And if you saw the announcement, it was with those little squares on the black, so you know what that was like. And it seemed to work pretty well. I mean, people were really interested, and
because a couple of weeks later, also opens at the Hudson Museum.
That was a Goosen, yes.
Yes.
And these were artists that he discovered. One of them was Carl Andre.
Yes.
Who was the first time I met him.
Right.
And some others, and so like I say, I just happened to be in the right place with the right people, and my mind was in that place also. Had become, and it was the way I was thinking. I think one thing about working with Motherwell, although I didn't work like that with him, I was doing, I suppose you might call it a kind of 10th generation action painting or something. It was the kind of work I was doing. but it was thinking about the nature of art,
Yeah.
because Motherwell was basically very quite philosophical about things,
Yes.
and this sort of, when he spoke about, he just didn't talk about art, but he'd talk about the relation of art with life and being an artist in New York and that sort of thing,
Sure.
what it was to be an artist, this is the way he thought about it,
Yeah.
And so, and I think this is carried on with my thinking when I moved on and saw other things that were going on, and
Yeah.
we're talking to Tony Smith, and he invited me to his place in New Jersey, by the way. He had a house in New Jersey.
Right.
And I met his wife, who was I think in show business at one point.
Okay.
And his daughters. He had,
Kiki.
Yeah. Right, And I saw his work. For some reason, he wanted me to see the first, I guess it was his first sort of like cube-like structure he had
Yeah.
out in the backyard of his house. And so I was introduced to all of these things, and then down the block from my gallery was a young dealer. His name was Seth Siegelob.
But before we go there, maybe just stay a second with the Westerly show and the Hudson show, because then now the Hudson Museum show is seen as being one of the first show on minimalist art, and which is striking and most beautiful that you would take part already in that first revolution back in 1964, and you would keep on for quite a good number of years with that process of reduction in the making the paintings itself, how you really worked from a minimalism in your own painting.
Yeah, I don't care to use those terms, to tell you the truth. I find them limiting.
Yeah,
and I was basically thinking of this is the way I relate to these images. This is the way I relate to the way I want to present these in the world.
Yes.
And move on. What is art? One of the things Guzen used to say was art is a form of knowledge. Oh, wow. This was one of his favorite experiments. I remember he had organized a show of student works and so forth, and I remember him coming in and saying, art is a form of knowledge. And this may be why he was a teacher.
Yeah.
If it's knowledge, then you don't repeat.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Knowledge is adding information on, adding ideas, coming up with new ideas, a new way of thinking about something.
Right.
And attempting to move on, not going back to what somebody else has done and making some variation on it, which unfortunately I think is 95% of what's going on in the art world, to tell you the truth. And so I was always... I think the way I thought about things was to continue moving on and just to keep myself interested, really, to make challenges.
Yeah.
And fortunately, there was always someone there who was willing to pick up on it and show it and put it up on a wall somewhere.
And that is truly wonderful, because also during that time from 1964 onwards, Guzen would invite you to become a teacher at Hunter as well.
Yes, right.
So you would join the faculty as...
I worked there for quite a... I worked there long enough to get my pension. I think you had to... I left...
1981.
In 81, right. So, I decided that I had to leave because I was traveling so much and showing, and I was doing like a half dozen shows a year, and I was spending half my time in Europe someplace,
But before we go to 81, let's just stick a little bit, and with that process of let's say, thinking what art and where art can lead you, it's just, so wonderful to how you will take the painting, work from the grid, the square, the rounds, forms on the painting, minimal form on the painting, and then suddenly gradually you come to paint the edge only of the painting, and that process leads you to look at the space between paintings.
Well, the space is what's going on in between things is very important.
Yeah.
So it's really based on these ideas of being in space. We exist in space.
Right.
And the energy between the person looking at the artwork and the artwork itself. The artwork is an object, but it's full of life and presents itself with ideas that you have to deal with, and how you deal with them on your own terms, from your history and so forth. And it just seemed to me that maintaining this energy presenting this possibility when someone comes to look at the work was important to me.
Yes.
And as a form of knowledge, constantly changing the nature of what art can be and how you relate to it became very important for me. That's why I don't repeat the same thing over and over, and I keep trying to move on to other things. Like you said, working with the edges and going off the canvas and the space around the canvas and all of this.
But that's the moment, and now comes back the history with Seth, because one of the first public shows you would do at Bradford, for instance, was it Bradford, where you had on the wall the 4 monochromes in each of the corner of the wall, and so therefore, do we look at the paintings, the monochromes, or do we look at the space between?
Well, both. Whatever is there, that's what you deal with. You look and think. It's not just looking.
You're right.
But looking and being engaged in every level you can, emotionally, intellectually, historically. How do you deal with this? You become engaged in the situation that you're in now.
Right.
Okay? And that's what it's about. And hopefully entering into a museum and becoming part of that situation.
Yeah.
And then seeing does that somehow change you? Does it add to your life in any way? And that's what hopefully that's what it does. It opens up another way of thinking. And it goes back to what you want art to be.
Yes.
What you think of this sort of undefined term, this activity that we came up with years, 20,000 years ago, when people started making little images on cave walls or something like that. What is that about? Why do we do it?
Yeah.
We probably made images of cows on cave walls before we had language,
Yes.
And language sort of words come out of these little drawings, those scratches on cave walls. And in a sense, it's still about that.
Yeah.
It may have gotten more complicated in life, may have become more complicated. But that's the way we are, and that's the way I think art should be, that it should always open up some new way of how we relate to the world.
Yes.
And how we can move away. Who knows where we'll be 1,000 years from now if we haven't destroyed ourselves?
Yeah.
Well,
once we're still here, though, what's fascinating is how you've just mentioned words come out of the images and what comes out of the works. What I found beautiful in studying that moment between 1967, let's say through 1972, for instance, is the way words will come back gradually. So once you've define the space with the 2 canvases, you did the nylon wires, the wire pieces that define space itself. And then gradually, through your relationship with Cesc Sigelab, you would come and present radio waves in the gallery. What is wonderful here is you have a process of reduction that leads to a seeming immateriality.
Well, the thing about Seth was he just accepted whatever I did. That was what was so good about it. He was always looking. Whatever I did, that was okay with him. He just thought that was his way of thinking. Unfortunately, and it wasn't just with me, it was the other artists that he worked with, with Larry Weiner and Doug Huber and so
Yes.
forth, Kasuth, etc. He decided he wanted to move on himself in his life.
Right.
And so he closed his gallery. But he didn't do it until he made sure we
Yes.
were associated with the right people.
Right.
Okay. And he
That's
went to
very-
Europe. He spent a lot of time in Europe,
Yes.
And he met Speroni and Ponza and Von Lambert. And then they came and talked to Leo Castelli.
Yes.
So one thing led to another. This is why I say I've been very lucky with the people that I'm
Oh, absolutely.
always
Yes.
somehow became that. The thing with Seth,
Yeah.
going down the block and stopping in the gallery. Did I tell you about when I first went down there?
Please do.
Well, she said you should go down and say he opened his gallery. I think he opened his gallery the same day that I had my show at Westerly.
Right.
And she said, you should go down and say hello, just, okay. So I go down. It was just down the block, really. It was on, what was it, 57th Street, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. In the mid-50s. So I go down there, and I go in the gallery. And you remember, Seth started as a rug dealer. He sold Oriental rugs. So there was this big empty space, and on the floor was this long rug. There was a table on the side. And Seth used to drink coffee. In those days, he would drink, there would be a tall glass, mostly half milk, half coffee, which he sipped all day long, and smoking, a cigarette.
Right.
He always had a cigarette he was puffing on. And he was on the phone, which he seemed to spend more than half his life on the phone, talking to somebody about something. And I walked in, I saw basically what you would see in the galleries in New York back at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. It was okay. The work was good, but you would find it any place. And there was one painting, not large, small, medium size, that was minimal, sort of geometric-y in a way. There was something about the color that was different.
Right.
It wasn't like an Ellsworth Kelly color or something like that,
Right.
Kenneth Nolan. It was different. The color, there was just something, the color was different. And I just looked and I said, and I pointed to it and I said, I like that one. I like that painting. And Seth looked up and he said, that's a Lawrence Weiner.
Right.
The thing about Larry's work was, he's like a totally individual artist. I think he's one of the great ones.
Yes.
One of the top. And there was just nobody like him. Nobody made art like him. Nobody, total individual. His point of view about life was quite remarkable. It was great fun to be with, very smart,
Very much.
loved to hang out.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought he was a great artist. We traded work. He liked my work. I liked his work.
Yeah.
So, I own like a whole bunch of stuff.
And I'm glad we speak about him because that leads us to the second revolution in your life, which is what I know you do not like the term, but what is now labeled as the conceptual art revolution.
Oh, yeah, that's another term. Larry didn't like that term. I don't know anybody that did. Maybe Kasuth liked it. I don't know. I never liked it.
But nonetheless,
hated it.
You would take part in that show, the January show.
Yeah, right.
And that's when you first present the radio wave piece and in the catalog and the radiation piece.
Well,
if I may, what's interesting with your relationship with Seth will be how you will start really, in a very short amount of time, at the beginning of 69 through to the end of 69, do so many revolutions again once more, from the radio piece, the radio wave piece, the radiation piece, and then in March, the inert gas pieces.
I guess my head was just full of ideas. That's all I can say.
Oh, no, but that's wonderful.
They kept moving and they were accepting of them, They always wanted to know something new.
But I wanted to, if you could talk to me a
and
bit
I had
about...
an easy, friendly relationship.
Yeah, because you guys went together, you and Seth, to California to realize the piece, as you've announced it in a March
That was his
1969
idea.
show. Yeah.
Seth wanted to go to California.
Yeah. But what I was interested about when in the gas piece is the way that you talk to me about the materiality of that very artwork.
Yeah.
Because you choose inert
Well, the
gases.
thing about inert gas was it doesn't mix with anything else. It's taken from the atmosphere and returned to the atmosphere. So you have that cyclical idea behind. It comes from the atmosphere, and
Yes.
it doesn't mix chemically with anything else.
Right.
So it always remains itself,
Yes.
really. And that was the idea of it, really.
Yeah, which is
The inert gas. There were 5 of them or 6. One of them was not available to me
yeah,
because
because
it was radioactive, something like that, radon or something it was called.
yes,
And that's why I was interested in it. I can't remember. I must have came across that idea some years earlier.
yes,
I'm not sure. Maybe in my research or school or maybe some teaching. I can't remember exactly, but it just sort of came on me. The idea of, and also the idea of invisibility, that it's there. It's something we breathe
yes,
in ourselves, and it can be isolated in a specific amount.
right,
And you start with a specific amount,
hmm,
which you can buy,
yeah,
any place, and it was available when I was teaching at Hunter. In fact, I went to I think one of the chemistry professors, something like that, a
yeah,
science professor, and inquired about him. And we had lunch, and they became fascinated. These
right,
two, we were having lunch in the cafe at Hunter,
yeah.
and they was really, all of a sudden they were fascinated.
But what's fascinating with them is once you release them, so in different sites,
Right.
sites that you choose, including one which was on the road in California for that famous movie.
Right.
That,
Well, we did the whole point was to document them,
yeah,
and this was something that Seth and I came up with. Seth, maybe Larry too. The term documentation, document something. You can get a document a performance,
yes,
or something like that. And that Seth said, I need something to sell. You got to give me something to sell. I said, can we just tell people about it? No, we have to print it, make photographs,
yeah.
So we did the documentation, the photo with the signed statement,
Yeah.
that whole thing.
But what I love about these is that you actually call them primary documentation. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's right. Where
And
the
why-
artist signed it, right.
And why primary
Who
documentation?
knows? I don't know. The secondary would be when it's reproduced in a catalog or
Right.
something like
So
that.
primary would be the first look at what the
That
event.
would be the signed statement by the artist. They would
Right.
sign it and date it with the photo taken by the artist or whatever.
But what's important is still just a
and you
documentation.
had to sort of design this thing, which would be framed.
Right.
You know. So
But
that
what's
was-
interesting about the notion of documentation is that, for instance, for the inert gas piece, what do we have now? And what you did right away at the time was the poster, where you
Yes, I did a
announce
poster.
an empty poster just with just one line at the bottom.
Right.
But what I find essential with that work, you see, is we go back to language. It is through language that you present the work. It is
Yeah.
that you announce, present, and
It's
document.
all about language, right? How do you tell people? How do you communicate?
Yeah.
How do you tell your ideas to people?
It seems to me that towards the end of 1969 is the moment when words become the piece of the art itself. No longer documentation, but we have the first definition pieces coming through. It is something which is part of.
Yeah.
Slowly, it seems that your work will drift away from these events that you had staged with the radio wave, with the radiation, with the inert gas, towards working with language itself. And I was interested about that because one of the most beautiful one I can think of right now will be your definition of an artwork. When you give the feeling of what it is without revealing its true nature. It is wholly indeterminate. It is ineffable. You will give us the understanding, the feel of the art through your art. But then we start to create a mental sculpture, a mental representation of what is happening there.
Hopefully, in the mind of the person looking at it, who can relate to art in some serious way,
Yes.
emotionally and so forth.
Absolutely.
I mean, it takes a certain amount of imagination on the part of the viewer. I call him the viewer or him or her
Yeah.
before. So, well, language is basic. Words are basic. How do you communicate? How do you make yourself known? And it's all part of somehow trying to come to grips with this function or this thing called art, whatever it is.
Right.
This activity, this thing that we engage in that we can't seem to put aside.
Yeah.
That occupies us and doesn't really have any specific definition. And every time we encounter it, we come up with something different. I find it an incredibly human activity, something very specific to the human beings and at the highest level of being a human. And it's what it is, what we are, what we have evolved to in this world that we live in this existence that we have, which is ever changing, always expanding, and I think is very, very basic, and what makes us some special creature. I think it has evolved. We used to use it to make pictures of our gods, you know? We don't worry about that anymore. To express things that were unexpressible. We use it to decorate our apartments and put some color there, you know, to make it look pretty.
Yeah.
That's one thing we can do. But I believe that the so-called modern art movement, the 20th century, was one of the great, as important as any other movement, Baroque or Renaissance. I think it's as important because it completely changed our relationship to this activity that we invented and that has evolved. What was art 100 years ago or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years ago is not what it is today.
Not at all, no.
And I think, and yet we can go back.
Yeah.
It's great to go back 2,000-3,000 years, or to look at a Van Eyck, or go back to a Vermeer.
Yeah.
I love to go back to her. It's one of my favorite artists. I think one of the great ones. Some of the greatest masterpieces I have found going to see his show. I've been several times. To see a view of Delft.
Right.
Which I think one of the great masterpieces. Anyway,
no, but I think this is truly wonderful.
So we can still relate to this work that was
Yes.
done hundreds of years ago, you know?
Yeah. And also, what will be fascinating is that when I think of your art, the process of reduction that we found in your painting early on, well, we will find the same way in the way you work with words. You will start by announcing, then you will move on to make a book, it is, it isn't. In the same time, you will start projecting slides of words on the wall. Again, seeking for an immateriality of the word, seeking a very different materiality at the very least. What is to be touched when it's just an image of a word?
Well, there's a lot. There is someone sitting there in the dark and looking, say, this is one, say, a projection in the dark, or sitting in the gallery.
Yeah.
With the lights on, and all of a sudden you see a word. What do you do with that? You know, and then all of a sudden it's gone, and there's an empty space. Then another one comes.
Right.
How do you deal with that? Now it's a different, because the word suggests things. They refer to things.
Right.
I don't want it to be specific, but to some aspect of reality, of the real.
Yeah.
You know, and how do you relate? How do you deal with that? Then it's gone, you're into another word. Yeah. Or you're sitting in the dark, and a word comes up. And then it goes black, and you're sitting in the black for a while. Then another word pops up. Light. It's light. The light against the dark.
Right.
It's that also. And it's being in that situation that's changing and unexpected. You're not really sure. Is that a real-life situation? Does it reflect in any way to something that we can relate to realistically, emotionally? It's trying to present a specific situation, a different situation that you have to deal with. Real references to the real world that may be personal, maybe not.
Right.
Confronting something. It's not dangerous. It's not going to hurt you. You know, you can relate to it in a friendly way, in a good way, in an
Right.
intellectual way, in an emotional way. But it may conjure up something that frightens you.
Yes. Yeah.
So you have to deal with it in a very personal way, and that's why I think of the viewer as, in there with the artist. We're all in this thing together for a short amount of time.
Right.
And as you get older, you realize how short this amount of time is.
Well, time is the essence of your art.
Time is very important. It's a thing. It's a great thing, whatever it is. I don't think we've quite figured it out yet. Is it something? Can we control it? Can we go back in time? Can we go forward? All of this. It is something. We haven't quite figured it out what it is.
Yeah.
It's the great energy that we can't escape. We're all part of it. If there's one thing that we're all part of, it's time.
Right.
We have to deal with it. And it's got to be part of the art. Just the way we think about it. I don't think we think about a Vermeer or Rembrandt or the way they thought about it when they were first presented.
Yes.
I think we've learned a lot. We've come across a lot since then.
Yeah.
That we apply. And ways of thinking about things. And I think art reflects this.
Yeah.
It's a very important activity that's part of us. And you have to appreciate it. You've got to get into it. It isn't some precious thing that you go to in some gallery someplace on 57th Street, spend a lot of money. It's a lot more than that. That's what it's become, unfortunately. But the really good stuff is more than that.
I agree. And let's go back to you once more. You've projected the words a slide, and then another step will be the recording and broadcasting the words, playing the words back in space. You would start in 1976, I believe, and that exhibition, which is for me essential, between the Gallery Julian Preto and PS1, where simultaneously in one gallery you would have the voice of a man, in the other the voice of a woman, speaking the same words.
And sometimes, but yes, that was one version. And sometimes there was a woman would say a word, then followed by a man saying it, and so forth and so on.
What's interesting about that is two things. First of all, again, we move in the materiality of the words. Now it's sound. And
yes, but also it's the fact that the sound of the voice, and the fact that it was a man and a woman, was there some conflict there? What's the difference? You have to deal with all of that.
Yes.
Not just the fact that it's words, but there's a lot of levels that I want you to think about, and the space between and the silence between. Indeed. And the resonance,
Well, the wonderful thing is, once more, we in an empty gallery, and what do we have is these words.
It's not really empty.
No, it's not empty at all when it's filled up with sound. That's
one of my favorite shots is Seth Siegelob sitting in this big empty space, listening to a sound piece. He's just sitting in the chair, looking up and listening. And I guess I don't remember exactly. Maybe once every 30 seconds a word would come. And this is what I want. People would enter the space, and all of a sudden a word would materialize out of nothing, And they say, what was that, Unfortunately, too many people would walk in, some would say, oh, not more words, and turn around and walk out, or... they didn't hear anything.
It demands attention.
Another empty gallery and walk out.
Right. Whereas your work demands attention, it demands presence, it demands engagement with.
That's it. it takes responsibility on the part of the viewer, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. It's not just some simple entertainment,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, there's an anecdote that you once told me, which I find striking, which was, I think it was 1977, when Tom Marioni invites you to San Francisco to the Museum of Conceptual Art, where you will do a show by putting a speaker in the empty gallery, the other one in the saloon downstairs, where people are having drinks for the opening night. The show lasts one night, but every 30 seconds, you told me, a word would come up.
Yes, that's right. Well, I've done that several times,
Yeah,
in fact.
but what you said was striking, that people would stop, silence.
Once they catch on to what's going on,
Yes.
everything would stop,
Right.
you know, and then they would become engaged. Right. I think there are some photos around.
Yeah, they
that
are.
might have been taken. Yeah.
And I love that, because, it's the power of something which is
Once they know that there's something happening,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden everything stops.
Which is the what?
And you become engaged in the silence
Yes.
and in the waiting and in the about what's coming next.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And isn't that a sort of an aspect of life?
True.
Hmm?
Yeah.
If you have an interesting life, if you know what's happening day by day, some people are happy that way, I don't know.
Right.
But if you have a life where you're sort of engaged and there's something happening,
Yeah.
your life has some variety to it. I think that's good.
And another incarnation of the words once more in your art is the moment when you start doing the wall drawings. So 1978 at Leo Castelli's gallery, and just the words in the shape of a square on a wall.
Yeah.
And again, what's beautiful about that is that the art is not about the object. The art is, you will not sell the wall. The art is to engage with the words on the wall, read them, and see the shape that they define. I was interested that the first one seems to be also not paint, but graphite, just penciled.
Yes.
And I love that materiality. There's a form of lightness to it. Ineffable.
Yeah. Pencil. I still use old pencil in my painting.
Right. But I was interested.
I like that
Yes.
idea of the pencil. Actually, someone once said, actually, a pencil will last longer. If you don't touch it, you don't do anything, you don't tear it up or throw it away. The pencil will, the paint may fade.
Right.
For
Yep.
many years, may dry up and flake away, but the pencil will always be there. It
Interesting.
won't go away if you don't touch it.
Right.
You don't. And that's somewhere in my current work. You notice I use pencil lines. We'll see. I don't know.
We'll see. But what's beautiful about these wall pieces, I would like us to stay there for a minute, is it brings back to another cosmology of friends of yours, Larry Winner, Sol Lewitt, using the gallery as the space for the art.
Right.
Which you have used the gallery quite literally early on when you used the mailing list, the mailers.
Oh, the mailing. Right.
You would use...
I've used mailing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was where the work was.
Yeah, absolutely. But it stemmed from the gallery system.
And the people would get this thing once a month in the mail. Some of them saved them, by the way.
Yeah.
I had all the galleries participated. I was working with like 7 or 8 galleries.
So we're talking the invitation piece here.
Yes.
So we're back in time with 1970,
Yeah.
early 70s, and you invite to the next show and the next show.
Yes, that's right.
For this
But
season.
it made a circle, like the first gallery. Maybe it started with Leo Castelli, and then, I don't know, maybe... And also, if you follow it on the map, it kind of makes a circle. Starts in New York and goes,
You're
to
right.
Germany, Paris. And if you follow on a map, it makes a big circle and eventually goes back to Leo Castelli in New York.
Which I love about these works, with these, because they use the gallery as a medium to such an extent that what you...
That was it. That's what I said. The gallery is the medium.
Yeah. You also close the gallery?
Closed gallery pieces, yes, that's right.
Indeed.
And I also did that with booths.
Yes,
And,
in art fairs context. But then also another work of yours, which is quite striking, which shows your generosity to other artists, which is very essential, is when you invite another artist. For instance, when you present the work.
Ian Wilson, I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Robert Barrett presents Ian Wilson, or something like that. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. But again, it's using the gallery system to invite someone in order to make your
various art activities, things, the various things that people do as artists, and using that as the medium. That's what they were all about, using the nature of the art world itself. The nature of what it is to show work and the mechanics of the art world.
Yeah.
Use that as the material that you're using to make the art.
Absolutely.
That's what it was about.
Yes. And that's what we found again when we look at your wall paintings. Because you use the gallery as a material. Yes, it can be reproduced, but it is produced.
But it never will be the same.
Indeed.
Space will always be different.
Yeah. Yes. And that is beautiful, because one of the things which is very striking is the moment when you move from the words to bring in the image of a tree as well within these. So I love this relationship between the word and the image here.
The tree image I liked. I wanted an image. Okay?
Right.
I was looking for something, I always had to move on.
Yeah.
What am I going to do next? I'm getting bored. The thing about the tree is that it starts in the ground with the dirt, the root, and springs up and goes up into the atmosphere.
Right.
So it starts in the dark and goes to light. So it's a kind of symbol of life and transformation and, you know what I'm saying, life and death and all of that.
Yes.
So that's what I liked about the tree image.
And it is
I call it a tree, yes. I don't use leaves or anything like that. And it's really a drawing of the veins of the tree or whatever, or kind of, I don't know what you would call it really, just the kind of, the life in the tree, the energy which is in the tree image.
Yeah.
It's not a specific tree or anything like that.
Not at all. It's a symbol.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, a kind of symbol, right? It's symbolic.
Yes.
And it goes down below in the darkness, in the deep energy of the earth, and reaches up into the heavens, into the sky. I just kind of like that idea, that image. I used it for a while, yeah.
You did indeed, yeah. And the moment when you combine both the words and the trees, a dialogue starts.
Yeah, well, that was the idea of it too, yes.
Yeah.
The different things going on, right?
Yeah. And now, what also I find is that's the only image I can think of that you would work, then you would come back to the words. And you will start using once more the wall, the size of the wall, to think about how the words come in relation to the wall. For instance, love too, you too.
Yeah, and also having the edges of the wall were cut off parts of the word. So you don't really know what that word could be. Maybe you only have a part of one letter of the word, or 2 or 3 letters,
Yeah.
And actually cutting it so that's in the most recent work, you see the letters are maybe cut off in the middle of a letter.
Yeah, but before that, you would actually use the wall, the size of the wall to give the diameter to the O's, and then divide the remaining space like you two that we're presenting now.
Yeah, well, that was right. Using the space, trying to adjust the work to the space.
Written in chalk, beautiful, very thin, very, very ephemeral, very And what's interesting is, as you've just said, then comes the fragmentation of the words. So the words are exploded all throughout the galleries now, on the wall, on the glass panels, and then becomes another relationship with nature once more.
And mirror pieces.
Yes.
That's how when you look at it, you see yourself reflected in the words over your face or in your eyes or whatever.
And I think that's very beautiful how, again, we're still within language. We're still within the letters. But then we're also engaging in a moment in time.
Well, dealing with the words as things in addition to what they could be, and what can't. There's certain words you can't quite figure out what they are because they're cut. Too much of it is cut off, or they're
Yeah.
upside down, or something like that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
playing around with the nature of using your imagination, trying to figure out what it might be if you care to do that.
Right.
It is about using the word as an object.
Right.
It is an object. It has form. The form may be changing and it may be infinite. But the idea behind the word remains. The definition is there no matter what it looks like. It may be tiny, microscopic. It might be huge, 100 feet high. But the idea behind it is the same. And, I mean, that's what I'm trying to work with anyway.
Oh, and you do that in a beautiful way.
Different images, different looks. But basically, it comes out of the same concept, if you want to say.
Well, true.
Or the same history, of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the size and the color affect the meaning that you will associate with when you engage in it.
Right.
Engage with it.
Yes. That's what we find with the new sculpture, that you realize words on the grass, where it reflects the grass, it reflects the sky.
Yeah, and I like it to be that's in the grass and reflecting the sky and all of that. But
Yeah. So they become something they take on the environmental aspect of your.
That's one way of using it. I've done other. I mean, I've made them out of stone and different color. Each word is different color and so forth.
Yeah. And let's conclude with that line that Lawrence Wiener said about your art, which I found, as always, you managed to encapsulate so much in so few words. And he said, Robert Barry made a situation a reality. Isn't it powerful? Isn't it? What do you
Very
respond?
Wiener-esque.
What?
Very Wiener-esque.
Very much so.
The thing about Larry's work, which I like, you have to adjust to deal with it. When you look at it, it's not something that's familiar. There's something else happening. You've got to make an adjustment to get into it.
Right.
Yes, there's language. Yes, they may be soaring off into space. But it's not something you've come across before. It's not a way of using the phrase. Mm-hmm. There's always that Wiener-esque way of thinking about things, that Wiener-esque look.
Right.
And you have to make an adjustment. You've got to shift to get into it.
Yeah.
I mean, once you're into it, it's great. And once you can... It's not something you're going to run across in everyday reading or writing or coming across somebody else's work or anything like that. There's always that difference.
Yeah.
That change. Yes, it's language, but it's not the language the way we normally encounter it in everyday use.
Well, very much like your art. What we have is the everyday words, but they acquire a different meaning, a different use, a different reality.
Yeah, but
Don't they?
It's a different way of coming to something you can deal with.
Yeah. But you've always refuted the notion of poetics within these.
Well, what is poetry? I mean, poetry is in one of these undefined terms, really.
Yeah.
Art
is much more appropriate.
The term poetic is applied to lots of different things. I mean, certainly it's okay with me. I'll take it.
Good.
I find it a high, complimentary to think of something as being poetic. I mean, it's how.
You're right.
But, like anything, you have different levels of music or, in the arts. And different ways of approaching.
Yeah.
What somebody else is offering as a work of art.
Right.
And which is okay, and if you can get into it.
Well, listen, Robert, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it was great fun.